We creatures are adrift, launched upon the tides of history. We have to cling to things, hoping that the friction of our contact will somehow suffice to countervail the currents that would otherwise sweep us to oblivion. As infants, clinging is the first thing we ever did. Isn't the strength in the newborn's hands and fingers remarkable? They are designed to cling, first to the little one's mother, then to others in its entourage, and still later to the sorts of things that enable the infant to get around or to pull itself upright. But grown-ups cling too, to their infants, of course, lest they be lost, but also to one another for security or in expressions of love and tenderness. And they cling to things that offer some semblance of stability. Indeed, there would be grounds for supposing that in clinging, or in holding on to one another, lies the very essence of sociality. A sociality, of course, that is in no wise limited to the human, but extends across the entire panoply of clingers and those to whom or that to which they cling. But then what happens when people or things cling to one another? There is an entwining of lines. They must bind in some such way that the tension that would tear them apart actually holds them fast. Nothing can hold on unless it puts out a line, and unless that line can tangle with others. And when everything tangles with everything else, the result is what I call a meshwork. And to describe the meshwork is to start from the premise that every living being is a line, or better, a bundle of lines. And in this lecture, I want to propose a theory of social life founded on this premise. It's a theory of the life of lines. Now, this is not how we are accustomed to think of the phenomena we study. It's more usual to visualize persons or organisms as blobs of one sort and another. Blobs have insides and outsides divided at their surfaces. They can expand and contract, encroach and retrench. They may bump into one another, aggregate together, even meld into larger blobs, rather like drops of oil spilled on the surface of water. But what blobs cannot do is cling to one another, not at least without losing their particularity in the intimacy of their embrace. For when they meld internally, their surfaces always dissolve in the formation of a new exterior. Now, in proposing a life of lines, I don't mean to suggest that there are no blobs in the world. My thesis is rather that in a world of blobs, there could be no social life. Indeed, since there's no life that is not social, that does not entail an entwining of lines, in a world of blobs, there could be no life of any kind. Now, in fact, most, if not all, life forms can be most economically described as a specific combination of blob and line, and it could be the combination of their respective properties that allows them to flourish. Blobs have volume, mass, density. They give us materials. Lines have none of these. What they have that blobs do not is torsion, flexion, and vitality. They give us life. Life began when lines began to emerge and to escape the monopoly of blobs. At the most rudimentary level, the bacterium, up there, combines a prokaryotic cell with a wisp-like flagellum. The cell is a blob, the flagellum a line. The one contributes energy, the other motility. And together, they conspired to rule the world. And to a great extent, they still do. For once you start looking for them, blobs and lines are everywhere. Think of the growth of tubers along the tendrils of a rhizome, or of the linear tail of the tadpole from the moment when it wriggles free from its globular spawn, and the filament that the silkworm spins in the construction of its cocoon. Think of the spider, whose blob-like body dangles from the end of the line that it has itself spun. Eggs are blobs of a kind, and fish turn from blobs to lines as they hatch out and go streaking through the water. The fetal blob of the mammalian infant, attached to the interiority of the womb by the line of the umbilical cord, is expelled at birth, only to reattach itself externally by clinging digitally to the maternal body. And people, well, children, as yet unfettered by the representational conventions of adulthood, often draw human figures as blobs and lines. The blobs endow them with mass and volume, the lines with movement and connection. Now take a look at this celebrated painting by Henri Matisse. It's called Dance. Matisse had a very blob-like way of depicting the human form. His figures are voluminous, rotund, and heavily outlined. And yet the magic of the painting is that these anthropomorphic blobs pulse with vitality. And they do so because the painting can also be read as an ensemble of lines drawn principally by the arms and legs. And most importantly, these lines are knotted together at the hands to form a circuit that is perpetually on the point of closure once the hands of the two figures in the foreground link up, and yet that always escapes that closure. The linking of hands, palm to palm, with fingers bent to form a hook, doesn't here symbolize a togetherness that is attained by other means. Rather, hands are the means of togetherness. That is, they are the instruments of sociality which can function in the way they do precisely because of their capacity, quite literally, to interdigitate. So for the dancers caught up in each other's flexion, the stronger the pull, the tighter the grasp. So in their blob-like appearance, Matisse gives us the materiality of the human form, but in their linear entanglement, he gives us the quintessence of their social life. So how should the social be described? Well, one way of putting it would be to say that this little group is both more and less than the sum of its individual parts. It is more because it has emergent properties, most notably a certain esprit de corps that can come only from their association. It is less because nothing in particular has prepared them for it. The association is spontaneous and contingent. And so while every one of the dancers trails his or her personal biography, much of this is lost, or at least temporarily held in abeyance, in the exhilaration of the moment. Now, social theorists have recently taken to using the word assemblage to describe such a group, or assemblage. As a concept, the assemblage seems to provide a convenient escape from the classical alternatives of having to think of the group either as nothing more than an aggregate of discrete individuals, or as a totality whose individual components are fully specified by the parts they play within the context of the whole. And yet, just as much as the alternatives it displaces, assemblage thinking rests on the principle of the blob. In place of 5 little blobs, or 1 big blob, it gives us 5 blobs that have partially run into one another, while yet retaining something of their individuality. But whether the parts add up to the whole or not, what is missing from this additive logic is the tension and friction that make it possible for persons and things to cling. There is no movement in the assemblage. It is as though the dancers had turned to stone. So the theory of the assemblage will not help us. It is too static, and it fails to answer the question of how the entities of which it is composed actually fasten to each other. The principle of the line, by contrast, allows us to bring the social back to life. In the life of lines, parts are not components, parts are movements. We should draw our metaphors perhaps from the language of polyphonic music. The dance of Matisse's painting would be called in music a 5-part invention. As each player in turn picks up the melody and takes it forward, it introduces another line of counterpoint to those already running. And each line answers or corresponds to every other. And the result is not an assemblage, but a roundel, not a collage of juxtaposed blobs, but a wreath of entwined lines, a whirl of catching up and being caught. Not for nothing did the philosopher Stanley Cavell come to speak of life as the whirl of organism. Because what distinguishes the whirl from the circle is that the whirl is never completed, it's never closed. To close the circuit would be to lock it down and bring movement to a standstill. It would be to achieve what theorists call social solidarity. What the dancers achieve in their correspondence, however, is precisely the opposite. Not solidarity, but vitality. As each passes the vital impulse to the next, they make it possible for the movement of life to keep on going. And to see how this happens, we need to take a lesson from a compatriot and exact contemporary of Matisse and one of the founders of modern social anthropology, the ethnologist Marcel Mauss. Textbooks define ecology as the study of the relations between organisms and their environments. Literally surrounded by its environment and enclosed within its skin, the organism figures, according to this definition, as a blob. Sometimes organisms of the same species cluster together in great numbers, as in the formation of coral, or in the nests and hives of so-called social insects. What is often known as a colony of conspecifics could be regarded either as an aggregate of discrete organisms or as a single superorganism. It's either lots of little blobs or one big blob. And it was on the foundation of this ecological notion of the superorganic that the discipline of sociology was established by its principal architects, Herbert Spencer in Britain and Émile Durkheim in France. For Spencer, the social superorganism was an aggregate of little blobs, that is to say, a plurality of individuals of the same species, human or non-human, joined by mutual self-interest, and it was modelled on the operations of the market. In the market, it's what changes hands that matters, not the hands themselves. The handshake seals a contract, but is not a contract, not an actual binding of lives in itself. Durkheim, for his part, launched his version of sociology on the back of a polemical critique of the Spencerian market model, above all in the pages of his manifesto for the new discipline, boldly entitled The Rules of Sociological Method and published in 1895. Society, for Durkheim, was one big blob. There could be no lasting contract, Durkheim argued, without some kind of warrant that would underwrite the union of otherwise fissile individuals. And this warrant must be sacrosanct. It must lie beyond the reach of individual negotiation. And so the Durkheimian superorganic was no mere multiplication of the organic, it was rather above the organic, situated on an altogether different plane of reality. And in a famous passage in The Rules, Durkheim argued that a plurality of individual minds or consciousnesses is a necessary but not sufficient condition for social life. In addition, these minds must be combined, but in a certain way. So what then is this way? How must minds be combined if they are to produce social life? Durkheim's answer was, and I quote, that by aggregating together, by interpenetrating, by fusing together, individuals give birth to a being, psychical if you will, but one which constitutes a psychical individuality of a new kind. And in a footnote he added that for this reason it is necessary to speak of a collective consciousness as distinct from individual consciousnesses. Aggregation, interpenetration, and fusion, however, mean different things. And in listing them one after the other, Durkheim effectively gives us three answers rather than one. So which answer is the right one? Is it by the aggregation of minds, their interpenetration, or their fusion that the consciousness of the collective is formed? Or are these supposed to represent three stages in a process that culminates in its emergence? Well, aggregation and fusion, as we've seen, rest on the logic of the blob. Both presuppose that the mind of the individual can be understood as an externally bounded entity, closed in on itself, and divided off both from other such minds and from the wider world in which they're situated. In aggregation, minds meet along their exterior surfaces, turning every such surface into an interface, separating the contents on either side. In fusion, these surfaces partially dissolve so as to yield an entity of a new order, a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. And yet, since in the meeting of minds, that portion that an individual might share with others is instantly ceded to this higher level emergent entity, what is left to the consciousness of the individual remains exclusive to its owner. So the whole may encompass and transcend its parts, but the parts have nothing of them, within them, of the whole. But interpenetration is different. If we were to be strict in applying Durkheim's logic, then interpenetration vanishes on the instant when it appears. It's like an unstable state that immediately resolves into a new balance of aggregation and fusion. When our minds meet, when I join my conscious awareness with yours, that zone of interpenetration ceases at once to belong to either of us and is lodged in an alien presence to which we are both held to account, namely society. Suppose once again that we seal our contract with a handshake. What changes hands belongs to you or to me. The handshake, however, would belong to society. From a Durkheimian perspective, it would be the ritual expression of a superordinate mode of existence to which we are both beholden. And yet, surely, the hands that clasp yours and that you feel at the very heart of your being are still my hands. I remain fully connected to them in body and mind, and so it is for you too. And this was precisely the burden of one of the most celebrated texts in the early 20th century history of the then nascent discipline of social anthropology, namely the essay on the gift, published in 1925 by Durkheim's leading disciple, Marcel Mauss. Though ostensibly written in homage to his mentor, Mauss in fact dealt a blow to the entire Durkheimian paradigm from which it never fully recovered. Because what he succeeded in demonstrating in this essay was the possibility of interpenetration as a durable condition. He showed how the gift I give to you, and that is incorporated into your very being, remains fully conjoined to me. Through the gift, my awareness penetrates yours. I am with you in your thoughts, and in your countergift, you are with me in mine. And so long as we continue to give and receive, this interpenetration can carry on or perdure. Our lives are bound or drawn together as literally as two hands clasping. Well, in this, of course, Mauss had only rediscovered what our distant predecessors already knew. Was it not precisely in such binding that the term contract finds its etymological origin from com, meaning together, plus trahere, to draw or pull, pulling together. That's what Matisse's dancers are doing, pulling together and responding to one another as they whirl around. Now, I've already introduced the notion of correspondence to refer to the polyphony of their movements, and it is key to the argument I wish to develop. Social life, I've suggested, lies not in the solidary accretion of blobs, but in the fluent correspondence of lines. But this argument both undercuts the logic of part-whole relations by which the whole is understood, as by Durkheim, to be more than the sum of its parts, and challenges the assumption that consciousness of any kind or at any level, individual or collective, can be regarded as wrapped up in itself. For minds and lives are not closed-in entities that can be enumerated and added up. They are open-ended processes whose most outstanding characteristic is that they carry on. And in carrying on, they wrap around one another like the many strands of a braid. A whole that is made up from individual parts is a totality in which everything is articulated or joined up. But the braid is always weaving, always in process, and, like social life itself, never finished. Its parts are not elementary components, but ever-extending lines, and its harmonies reside in the way each strand, as it issues forth, coils around the others and is coiled in its turn, in a countervalence of equal and opposite twists, which hold it together and prevent it from unraveling. Not that this prevented Mauss from advocating research into what he called total social phenomena, but their totality is quite unlike that of the whole, which is more than the sum of its individual parts. It is not additive, but contrapuntal. Like that of Matisse's roundel, it is a totality in movement, and this movement, far from advancing towards a conclusion, is self-perpetuating. To witness this totality, Mauss declared, is to see things as they really are. He wrote, not to see things as they really are, not merely ideas and rules, but also men and groups and their behaviors. We see them, he said, in motion, as an engineer sees masses and systems, or as we observe octopuses and anemones in the sea. Now, in the extensive critical literature that has grown up around Essay on the Gift, this beautiful oceanic metaphor has been almost completely ignored. And yet it is both profound and central to what Mauss had to say. Real-life human beings, he insisted, Real-life human beings inhabit a fluid reality in which every being has to find a place for itself by sending out tendrils which can bind it to others. And thus, hanging on to one another, beings strive to resist the current that would otherwise sweep them asunder. Observe octopuses in the sea. They do not aggregate and they do not fuse, but they do interpenetrate. With their eightfold brains in their tentacles, they entwine with themselves and with other denizens of the ocean to form a boundless and ever-extending meshwork. Incidentally, this picture is called Fashionable Octopus Games and comes from a woodblock print from the Edo period of Japan around about 1840. I think most would have liked it. So, how should we describe the interpenetration of lifelines in the mesh of social life? One possible answer would be to think in terms of knots. A knot is formed when a strand, such as a string or a yarn, is interlaced with itself or another strand and tightened. My suggestion is that in a world where things are continually coming into being through processes of growth and movement, that is, in a world of life, knotting is the fundamental principle of coherence. It is the way in which contrary forces of tension and friction, as in pulling tight, are generative of new forms. And it is about how these forms are held in place within such a force field, or in short, about making things stick. The stickiness of the knot is not a thickening or a coagulation that sets it off as a thing in itself over and against the world, because its topology is such that one can never determine what is on the inside or on the outside. Knots don't have insides and outsides, they have interstices. Their surfaces, rather than enveloping their material mass, lie between the lines that make them up. So, in what way might knots and knotting, thus conceived, register in the field of human relationships? And the answer I propose hinges on what it means to say of people's lives that they are joined. The question of the join surely lies at the very heart of our understanding of the social. And here I think the ontology of the blob, or what has come to be known in philosophical circles as object-oriented ontology, has led us to an impasse. For it conjures up a world comprised of more or less solidified elements that can have no direct access to each other's interiority, save by their fusion in the constitution of compounds in which any trace of joining immediately disappears. I mean, suppose I have a lump of copper and a lump of tin. Copper is copper, and tin is tin, and there's no way the two lumps can bind with one another except by forming an alloy, whereupon the relation between them immediately becomes constitutive of a new lump, namely bronze, with its own irreducible and inscrutable essence. And perhaps it's the same with you and me. If we enter into a relationship, doesn't this bring into existence something new that is neither you nor I, but in which we have both yielded something of our respective selves? This was precisely Durkheim's argument. in the Rules of Sociological Method concerning the constitution of society, and he actually used the analogy of melding copper and tin into bronze to make it. Individuals may transact with one another through external contact, as they do in the marketplace, but society, Durkheim argued, is seamless. In an ontology of the not, to the contrary, the essence of sociality lies not in any combination of interior fusion and exterior accretion, but in what might be called the principle of interstitial differentiation. And by this I mean that each constituent line, as it bodies forth in life, lays its own trail from within the interstices of its enmeshment with others. In the knot, constituents are not joined end to end in chain formation, but in the middle. Knots are always in the midst of things, while their ends are on the loose, rooting for other lines to tangle with. And this is so regardless of whether the lines are rigid or flexible. True, the weaver's knot unites flexible threads, whereas the carpenter's joint unites rigid beams. And yet in the field of the tectonic arts, as the doyen of architectural history, Gottfried Semper, argued in the mid-19th century, weaving and carpentry are of a kind. This is actually a picture from Semper's 1878 book on style in technical and tectonic arts. Semper was fascinated by etymology and found support for his ideas in the affinity of the German words for knot, knoten, and joint, nacht, both of which appear to share the Indo-European root, notch, N-O-C, whence nexus and necessity. And what's at stake here, as Semper was well aware, is more than just a question of technique. Rather, it touches on the more fundamental question of what it means to make things. Because for carpenters and weavers alike, it is necessary to join their constituents. However, the necessity of the knot is not a brittle one that allows for freedom only in the spaces left between, but a supple necessity that admits to movement as both its condition and its consequence. That is to say, it's not the necessity of predetermination, whose antonym is chance, but a necessity born out of commitment and attention to materials and the way they want to go. Its antonym is negligence. And as we have only to substitute persons for materials to see that this too is the necessity of social life, that is, of life lived in correspondence with others. Let me push this analogy with carpentry a little further. For what Semper argued regarding the joint in the field of material relations closely parallels what Mauss had to say about the gift in the field of social relations. In the mortise and tenon, one piece is made ready to receive the other, such that their subsequent interpenetration, hidden away in the interiority of the joint, is an enduring condition. Just as the tenon cut in one piece and that is offered to the mortise cut in the other remains fully with the first even as it is received into the second, so the hand I offer you in greeting remains fully mine even as you hold it in your grasp. And so it is too with the constituent lines of the knot. As with the knot, we might say that pieces of timber or hands that extend in welcome are joined, but not joined up. For the adverb up connotes a finality that is belied by the ongoing life of the thing. It's no more joined up than used up. On the contrary, it carries on. Like lines of polyphonic music whose harmony lies in their alternating tension and resolution, the linear constituents of the knot possess an inner feel for one another and are not simply linked by external contiguity. And I shall adopt the term sympathy to refer to this feel. It is because lines are bound in sympathy that I am unwilling to use the term assemblage for the whole comprised of them. Indeed, precisely as the line differs from the blob, so the knot differs from the assemblage. In the knot, constituents are joined not up, but with. Or as the design theorist Lars Spoybroek explains, sympathy is a living with rather than a looking at, a form of feeling knowing that operates in the interstices of things. It is, Spoybroek writes, what things feel when they shape each other. Now, Spoybroek's examples come from the art and architecture of the Gothic, with its exuberance of arboreal pillars, wreaths, and fronds, rendered in such materials as stone, timber, lead, and stained glass. But the human body, too, is a complex of knots and joins, whose members must be in sympathy if the person is to remain alive and well. Topologically, the heart is a tube in the form of a knot. The bones, however, meet at the joints. The parallel between well-joined stone and timber in the construction of temples and well-joined limbs in the body of the warrior, the one conferring resistance against violent weather, the other resistance against the violence of enemies, was a recurrent theme in Homeric poetry. The verb ararisko, to join, commonly used for both, was one of a host of words based on the Indo-European root, ar, from which are also derived not just the warrior's arms and the builder's or maker's arts, that in Latin armus or ars, but also article and, of course, articulate. And these latter terms already harbored the seeds of later usage, wherein the joint came to mark a point not of sympathetic union, but of attachment and separation between discrete and rigid parts, most notoriously the bones of the body, whether the animal body in a butcher's shop or the human body in an anatomy class. The body laid out upon the dissecting table figures in this anatomical apprehension as a totality assembled from its parts. It appears joined up. This, however, is an apprehension divorced from life. For the living being, the joint, which, like the rest of the skeleton, was never actually assembled, but rather grown with the person to whom it belongs, the joint is not so much an exterior connection of rigid elements as an interior condition of sympathetic union, bonded on the inside by means of a linear mesh of ligaments. In one of his notebooks, the artist, Paul Klee, provides a beautiful illustration of this principle, showing how the blob-like osseous elements that meet at a joint can form a flexible and sympathetic bond only thanks to their embedding in a linear matrix of ligaments. But if there is a warning in this, it has not been heeded by the majority of contemporary theorists who, given the choice, invariably favor long words over short ones in order to enhance the allure of their work. Better articulate, then, than simply join. But this substitute has had fateful consequences, for the effect has been to cut the knot, to sever the ties that bind, and to put in place of the correspondence of sympathetic movements, of going along together, an articulation of entities chained end to end. Joining with has given way to joining up, counterpoint to addition. I've already shown how the joining with of correspondence entails of necessity an attention to others and to the ways they want to go. And in what follows, I shall elaborate further on this idea that life is lived not intentionally, but attentionally with others. And I shall show that a life lived attentionally is also a life of longing. But first I want to introduce another pair of terms which are central to my argument. And these are the verbs to do and to undergo. In a work entitled Intellectual Foundations of Faith, dating from 1961, the American theologian Henry Nelson Wyman was specifically concerned to understand in what senses a human life can be creative. It is necessary, he argued, to distinguish between two kinds or two meanings of creativity. There is, on the one hand, the creativity that is expressed in what people do. A person is creative in this sense, according to Wyman, when he or she constructs something according to a new design that has already come within reach of his imagination. This is the sense most commonly invoked when creativity is identified with innovation. And it's found by looking back from a final product, or what Wyman called a created good, to an unprecedented idea in the mind of an agent in whose activity it was actualized. Doing is to making here as performance to product. It has a preconceived end. On the other hand, however, is the creativity that progressively creates personality in community. And Wyman's contention is that behind the contingencies of what people do and the miscellany of products or created goods to which these doings give rise is the creative good that is intrinsic to human life itself in its capacity to generate persons in relationships. This kind of creativity, he says, is what personality undergoes but cannot do. It doesn't begin here with an idea in mind and end there with a completed artifact. For social life is not something the person does, but what the person undergoes, a process of ontogenesis in which human beings both grow and are grown, undergoing histories of development and maturation within fields of relationships established through the presence and activities of others. And critically, this growth is not just in strength and stature, but also in knowledge, in the work of the imagination, and in the formation of ideas. So what then is the relation between doing and undergoing? Which comes first? Do we bracket undergoing within doing, or vice versa? Well, the first alternative takes us directly to the rhetoric of change. When stuff is moved from one state to another, it's said to undergo material change. When people are moved from one state to another, they are said to undergo social change. When planetary systems are moved from one state to another, they are said to undergo global change. Indeed, in a world driven by the mutually reinforcing agendas of corporate finance, big science, and state power, the paradigm of change has assumed a hegemony that is probably without parallel in the history of ideas. And so it's vitally important to understand the sense of undergoing that this paradigm implies. Undergoing in this sense is passive. It is the result of what in the doing is done to things, to persons, and to the earth. It is a test that casts the undergoer in the role of patient or victim, or experimental subject, or perhaps as user or consumer, wedded to the implementation of projects or protocols that have already been laid down at the outset. Now, this is not to deny the possibility of resistance, but we do not resist the paradigm of change by appeal to permanence and stability, because that would only reinforce the conflation of undergoing with victimhood, with being done to, not to challenge it. Wyman's purpose in insisting upon the intrinsic creativity of human life was precisely to refute the assumed passivity of undergoing. Were all undergoing to be confined within doing, within designs that have already come within reach of the imagination, then there could be no creation in it, only execution. Wyman's key insight was that at least in the social lives of humans, undergoing always overflows doing. And undergoing in this sense is active, not passive. It's the way in which human beings don't just live their lives, but lead them. And to follow Wyman, then, is to place doing within undergoing, and to place the production of created goods within the creative good that is social life. But what then becomes of imagination? If to do, as Wyman said, is to act upon a design that has already come within reach of the imagination, then how can the imagination reach for what is not yet within its grasp, for that of which it has no conception? In a famous essay on history as a system written in 1935, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset insisted that appeals to the imagination in the name of such notions as soul, psyche, or spirit are misguided, because they place at the origin of our actions a conclusion that is never actually reached. In truth, Ortega writes, the only thing that is given to us and that is when there is human life is the having to make it. And this life-making, Ortega insisted, is not just living. Animals live, becoming whatever it's in their nature to be. Humans, however, must perforce determine what they are going to be. So the fulfillment of human life is always deferred, always not yet. Man, says Ortega, is a not yet being. Now, another word for the not yetness of being is aspiration. So humans aspire, and yet in doing so they reach out at every moment of their lives from places already held or from positions already grasped. Thus, the movement of human life, by comparison perhaps to that of other animals, is temporarily stretched. Out in front is the not yet of aspiration. Bringing up the rear is the already there of prehension. So at once, already and not yet, we humans, it seems, are constitutionally ahead of ourselves. In every venture and at every moment, both fully prepared and yet utterly unprepared for things to come. Our preparation lies in an education of perception by which we become practiced in both attending and responding skillfully to salient aspects of our environment. Through such attunement, we acquire a certain practical mastery. Walkers become skilled in detecting and responding to irregularities of the ground surface, enabling them to keep their balance in tricky terrain. Hunters become skilled in reading the whereabouts and recent movements of animals from their tracks, enabling them to give chase. Mariners become skilled in navigation and seamanship, enabling them to handle their craft in all kinds of conditions. And yet, with mastery comes its opposite, namely submission. To embark on any venture, whether it be to set out for a walk, to hunt an animal, or to sail the seas, is to cast off into the stream of a world in becoming, with no knowing what will transpire, and it's a risky business. So the walker, a master of the terrain, must follow the path ahead with no surety of where it will lead. The hunter, a master of the chase, puts himself at risk in the pursuit of prey, and the mariner, a master of his ship, must submit to the elements. So the walker, as indeed the hunter and the mariner, once embarked upon a course, is at the mercy of the befalling of things. He is bound to attend in the sense not of reading what is already there, but of paying heed to the way things are going. Recall that the verb attendre in French means to wait, and that even in English, to attend to things or persons carries connotations of looking after them, doing their bidding, and following what they do. Thus, walkers, hunters, and mariners alike must wait upon the world and abide by its summons. And this waiting is something they are compelled to forbear. So in these, as in countless other examples, proficiency and vulnerability, practical enskillment and existential risk are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is attention. So what's the relation between preparation and unpreparedness, or between the modes of attention that lie respectively in attunement and forbearance? If, as I suggested, unlike other creatures which live their lives but do not lead them, the lives of humans are stretched between the already and the not yet, well then what leads and what follows? The usual answer is to claim that as intentional beings, that is, as agents, humans deliberate before they act, in Byman's sense of doing what has already come within reach of the imagination. The agent has an aim in mind and is determined to reach it, and thus the outward cast of action follows the inward cast of thought. The mind commands, and the body submits more or less mechanically to its directions. Mastery in this account is cognitive. If humans lead their lives, It is entirely thanks to their capacity to conceive of designs in advance of their execution, something of which animals, at least for a science of mind constructed on Cartesian principles, are deemed incapable. But to frame doing within undergoing is to put the assumed relation of temporal priority between mastery and submission into reverse. Here, submission leads and mastery follows. Rather than a commanding mind that already knows its will, trailing a subservient body in its wake, ahead is an aspirant imagination that feels its way forward, improvising a passage through an as yet unformed world, while behind is a prehensile perception already accustomed to the ways of the world and skilled in observing and responding to its affordances. Now, a life that is led by attention rather than driven by intention is held in the tension between submission and mastery, between imagination and perception, between aspiration and prehension, and between forbearance and attunement. And in every one of these pairings, the first leads and the second follows. But the lead of the first is not commanding, but tentative. It requires of its following not passive obedience, but active delivery. So pushing the boat out, I call on my powers of perception to respond. And yet, in that very response, I discover that unbeknownst to me, I've been there before, as have my predecessors since time immemorial. Thus, all imagining is remembering. We're fortunate to have a simple word in English which perfectly captures this congruence of memory and imagination. It is longing. Earlier, I argued that the movement of human life is temporally stretched. Longing, then, is another word for the stretching of a life along a line. It lies in the excess of aspiration over expectation, or of undergoing over doing. And like a coil that proleptically loops back in the very movement of its advance, and that in doing so continually pulls up the present as the future's past, longing has no destination. Rather, it ends where it begins, beyond conceptualization, leaving only its quickly fading after images in our hopes and dreams. And in this sense, longing is the impulse of what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze calls immanent life. Such a life is not to be found in a record of achievements, nor can it be reconstructed like a curriculum vitae by listing the milestones along a route already travelled. It rather passes between milestones, as a river between its banks, pulling away from them as it sweeps by. So a life of longing doesn't connect things up, but runs forever in between. In between, however, is one thing. Between is quite another. And the difference between and in between, though it might look like mere pedantry, is in truth of enormous ontological consequence, and indeed underwrites my entire argument. To elaborate, between articulates a divided world that is already carved at the joints. It is a bridge, a hinge, a connection, an attraction of opposites, a link in a chain, a double-headed arrow that points at once to this and that. In between, by contrast, is a movement of generation and dissolution in a world of becoming where things are not yet given, such that they might then be joined up, but are on the way to being given. It's a movement that flows one way, in a direction orthogonal to the double arrow of between, but with no final destination. So between has two terminals. In between has none. Any movement in the between is merely from here to there, from an initial to a final state. It's what we call change, the undergoing that is framed within doing. In the in-between, however, movement is the primary and ongoing condition. So where between is liminal, in-between is arterial. Where between goes across, in-between goes along. Where between is intermediate, in-between is midstream, and the in-between is the realm of the life of lines. Now, I began with the figures depicted in Matisse's painting, Dance, and we can return to it now, for in their movement and their harmony, more is clearly going on than can be grasped by the observation that the figure in the middle background, for example, stands intermediate between those, respectively, to her right and to her left. In the whirligig, a headstrong future plays continual catch-up with a resurgent past. Here, the dancers are not just standing between one another, they are corresponding, they are midstreaming. Theologians call this perichoresis, referring to the dance in which each of the divine persons of the Trinity revolves around the others, generating in their circulation a longing that springs not from any one person in particular, but from their mutual adoration. And in this, as I've shown through the comparison of the knot and the joint, in this they are not joined up, but with. Up is an enchaining or articulation of static elements. With is a gathering of materials in movement, as in carpentry and textiles, which develop a feel for one another, that is, a sympathy on the inside. And as my argument implies, the dynamic in-betweenness of sympathetic relations is radically distinct from the static betweenness of articulation. So what then of the betweenness of human relationships? Social life goes on between people, doesn't it? Why else do we speak of interaction as its rudiment? Action and speech, writes Hannah Arendt in her reflections on the human condition, go on between men, and women too, of course. And this sounds like a statement of the obvious until we stop to ask, what is this between? We commonly denote the matters with which people deal and about which they speak by the term interests, from Latin inter, between, plus esse, to be. Literally, in Arendt's definition, that which lies between people and therefore can relate and bind them together. Interests, thus, are intermediate. But besides acting towards and speaking about their worldly interests, people also act and speak directly to one another, and in so doing, the physical, worldly, tangible between of their material interests is overlain by an in-between of an altogether different kind. I'll just quote again from Arendt. This second, subjective in-between is not tangible, since there are no tangible objects into which it could solidify. The process of acting and speaking can leave behind no such results and end products. But for all its intangibility, this in-between is no less real than the world of things we visibly have in common. And we call this reality the web of human relationships. But then what is exactly the difference between these two betweens? Do they fall, as Arendt would have it, on either side of a division between objects and subjects, things and persons, material and immaterial? Is the betweenness different because of its predicate, of what it both divides and binds? I want to suggest to the contrary that the difference lies in the betweening itself. It's not that one between is objective and the other intersubjective, but that one is given in intermediacy, the other generated in midstreaming. And midstreaming is just another word for longing. As we've already seen, longing has no origin and no destination. It's not intermediate, halfway to a destination, or a cup half full, nor is it pulled in two directions at once. It is rather in the midst, undestined, a cup that has never ceased overflowing, and it runs one way. And that's why I have trouble with the concept of intersubjectivity as a way to talk about human social relations. In his manifesto for an existential anthropology, and with due acknowledgement to Arendt, Michael Jackson urges that our first rule of method should be to focus not on relata, but on the subjective in-between, on that which comes into being in this intermediate space of human interest and interaction. That's a quote from Jackson. But as the litany of terms bearing the prefix inter reveals, intersubjective, intermediate, interest, interaction, Jackson's in-between is, in fact, the in-between of the double-headed arrow. He has reduced the in-between of social life, of what, as Wyman had it, personality undergoes but cannot do, to a reciprocal toing and froing between subjects in which what each undergoes is framed by what the other does. Or in other words, he has reduced midstreaming or longing to intermediacy. Contrary to Jackson, I believe that our focus should be on the becoming of persons and things within the midstream of correspondence, rather than on the intermediacy of interaction. Science studies scholar Karen Barad is, I think, getting at much the same thing with her concept of agential intra-action. But to my mind, this concept still misses its mark. The trouble with intra-action is that it precisely reverses the between of interaction, turning it outside in, whereas with midstreaming, I aim for a 90-degree rotation, converting the bilateral to the longitudinal, between to a long. So correspondence, in my terms, is about longing for things, not about siding with them. So our prefix of choice should be neither inter nor intra, but mid. And if this is hard to put into words, it's in part because the grammatical categories with which we are familiar today impose an opposition between the active and the passive voice of the verb, according to which, as linguist M.L. Benveniste put in a classic study, the former, the active voice, is for action done, and the latter, the passive voice, for action undergone. We therefore have the greatest difficulty in expressing an undergoing that is active rather than passive, or in other words, a submission that leads rather than follows. Yet, as Benveniste tells us, the active-passive opposition is neither ancient nor universal. Plenty of non-Indo-European languages don't have it, and even within the Indo-European fold, it has emerged historically from a decomposition of what ancient Greek grammarians called the middle voice. It was this decomposition that put mastery, as it were, out in front, separating the doer from the deed, agency from action. In the middle voice, by contrast, the agent is inside the process of his or her action, inside the verb, and not separate from it. The doer, says Benveniste, achieves something which is being achieved in him. And this achievement is nothing less than human history, a history in which we make ourselves and others from within, even as we grow along our respective lines. Thus, the line speaks, neither in the active voice nor in the passive voice, but in the voice of the middle. Deleuze puts the point in a nutshell. A line of longing or becoming, he writes, is always in the middle. One can only get it by the middle. A becoming is neither one nor two, nor the relation of the two. It is the in-between. And such is the in-between of immanent life, a life in which there are no subjects, no objects, no subject-object hybrids, only verbs. I think I'm a verb instead of a personal pronoun, wrote Ulysses S. Grant, 18th President of the United States, on his deathbed. A verb is anything that signifies to be, to do, or to suffer. I signify all three. Then he died. So to human is a verb. Wherever you find them, humans are humaning. And this result might be compared with a remark from anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro, ventured in the context of a discussion of what he calls cosmological perspectivism. The capacities of conscious intentionality and agency, de Castro writes, define the position of the subject. Thus, intentionality, subjectivity, and agency are packaged into an indissoluble triad of mutual implication. But in my triad, intention is replaced by attention, the subject by the verb, and human agency by the doing in undergoing of the middle voice. And together, these three components add up to what I have called correspondence. So for the betweenness of subjects in Arendt's formulation, I substitute the correspondence of lines, and for the web of human relationships, I substitute the meshwork. And in what follows, I'd like to put forward some speculations on the anthropological potential of the concept of correspondence in the traditional disciplinary subfields of kinship and affinity, ecology and economy, ritual and religion, politics and law. We're accustomed to speaking of the lines of kinship and to drawing these lines in genealogical diagrams. It's also usual in such diagrams to depict them as linking persons point to point. Kinship is made to look as though its lines connect. But correspondence thinking acknowledges what the people among whom we work already know, namely, that the lines are living persons. So kinship is not so much a connection between points as a meeting of lines. Therefore, there are no lines of kinship as such, only correspondences. The life-historic lines which correspond in kinship are, by the same token, lines of feeling or sentiment, whose rooting for one another rests upon what social anthropologist Maya Fortes famously called the axiom of amity. For Fortes, kinship is equated with amity, non-kinship with its negation. For what do kinspersons do? They attend to one another in the sense of abiding with, caring for, and doing each other's bidding, on which I've already elaborated. As an unconditional commitment to a life undergone with others, kinship holds in abeyance those particular and determinate interests that lie between others and the self. The imperatives of kinship, in other words, are those of immanent life, of a life of longing. Indeed, we could go so far as to define kinship as a correspondent process of doing in undergoing, whose constitutive lines, far from articulating end to end, join in the middle, in the midst of things. And it's precisely in this respect, that kinship differs from affinity. The correspondences of kinship are observed unconditionally, wherever they may lead, but affinity offers strategy and choice. Kinship is thus inscribed upon a plane of immanence that lies in between the points or nodes that affinity joins up. Affinity is between, kinship in between. Turning to ecology and economy, both terms share a common root in the Greek word for house, oikos. Economy is householding, and in ecology, as originally defined by the zoologist Ernst Haeckel in 1866, nature herself becomes a household, in the continuation of which each and every organism plays its part. But what could a household be in a world of living lines? Certainly not the potato in a sack so commonly invoked in studies of tribal and peasant societies organized by the so-called domestic mode of production. It is not a blob. It would be more analogous to a knot from which lines fan out, tangling with the lines of all the other living things which in their habitation of the earth deposit their own trails in the form of roots and runners, paths and tracks. To make a living, farmers and woodsmen must join with the ways of plants, hunters and herdsmen with the ways of animals, artisans with the ways of their materials. So production in such an ecology of correspondence is about attending to the trajectories of these non-human lives. Writing of the labor process in the pages of Kapital, Karl Marx insisted that the producer's purposive will manifesting itself as attention must be operative throughout. And note this well, the mark of production lies not in the masterful imposition of prior intentions, already settled in the imagination, upon the materials of nature, as implied in the classic definition of man as homo faber, nor do these materials submit passively to what, in the name of humans' ends, is done to them. On the contrary, as much as kinship is about attending to persons, economy is about attending to active materials. And in this, as Marx and Engels had earlier insisted, humans are the producers not just of objects to consume, but of their actual material life. They too are transformed in the process. What they achieve is achieved in them. To produce, in short, is actively to undergo in the middle voice. And just as undergoing always overflows doing, so the production of life always exceeds the finalities of consumption. Then, like kinship in economy, religion too is fundamentally a knotting of lines. Though the etymology of the term is disputed, at least one interpretation has it as a compound of re, again, and ligare, to bind or fasten. Religion is thus rebinding, and lines and knotting seem to be at the heart of it. And yet, classically, discussions of religion have been waylaid by questions of belief and the supernatural. This is to think of the religious imagination as the power of representation, of giving form to appearances or dressing a world already in place with images of the divine. I've argued to the contrary that imagination is not about representing things, but about a longing for that which lies beyond the reach of conceptualization. It is the impulse of a life that, in continually running ahead of itself, leads by submission. And this perhaps gives us a better way of understanding religious sensibility as a matter not of belief but of faith. Religious faith, as the theologian Peter Candler puts it, is founded in a grammar of participation, not of representation. It has nothing to do with holding beliefs about or concepts of the world, and everything to do with corresponding with it. It is about commitment and the passion that infuses it, about the recognition of what we owe to the world for our existence and for our capacity to act. So the combination of attentionality, leading by submission, and doing in undergoing, that, as I've shown, is of the essence of correspondence, is perfectly captured in the concept of religious observance. What is failure to observe? It is to deny the necessity of the not. It is negligence. Whoever has no religion, as philosopher Michel Serres astutely notes, should not be called an atheist or an unbeliever, but negligent. And that correspondence, moreover, has a political dimension, is clear from the writings of both Ortega y Gasset and Hannah Arendt, which I've already touched upon. From Arendt, I take the idea that the leader is necessarily a participant in social life, and that in this regard his strength to act comes not from him alone, but only from what others have lent him, without which he could achieve nothing. Indeed, the despot who claims all strength to himself is as deluded as the cognitive scientist for whom the mind owes nothing to the world for its powers of command. Whether it be the submission of subjects to their master or that of the body to its mind, the encompassing of undergoing within doing, as Arendt shows, is no more than a facade that hides its opposite, namely that doing is always encompassed within undergoing. Or in Arendt's terms, it's not for some to act and others to suffer, rather both action and suffering always go along together. They're two sides of the same coin. And from Ortega, in turn, we learn that humans are auto-fabricators, that what they are is what they have made of themselves, not some nature that was there before history began. So for what we humans are, we bear a historical responsibility. And law is the codification of this responsibility and of the rights and obligations that follow from it. There can be no responsibility, however, without responsiveness. To be answerable, we must be able to answer. And yet our very existence as sentient beings capable of answering and being answered to depends on our immersion in the in-between. Without the affect generated through the inner feeling for one another of sympathy or correspondence, no system of regulation could function. For bereft of affect, how could any judgment, albeit justified in cold logic, carry practical or motivational force? Ultimately, then, as responsibility rests on responsiveness, any system of law and ethics must be founded on the correspondences of the in-between. Man, Ortega famously declared, has no nature. What he has is history. And we can now go one step further. History is correspondence, the process in which human lives, in their passage and their self-making, in their aspiration and prehension, their imagination and perception, their exposure and attunement, submission and mastery, in which human lives continually answer to one another. For the generation of anthropologists writing in the mid-20th century, Ortega's declaration stood for their belief that human experience was shaped by histories of culture and not by the determinations of biology. Others wondered why these alternatives should be mutually exclusive. Couldn't man have both biology and culture? Could he not be shaped at once by both nature and history? But that's not what Ortega had in mind at all. History for him was not man's culture, but his life. Life is not one complementary part of the package. For Ortega, it is all man has. But if that's so, then what becomes of human evolution? Haven't we evolved as the species of being we are over millions of years, compared with which the entire course of history, regardless of when we suppose it might have begun, is little more than the blink of an eye? And has this evolution not left us with a suite of durable capacities and dispositions that have long remained more or less immune to the vagaries of history? Well, that humans have evolved is not in doubt. But that this evolution has established a fixed stage for the play of history cuts right across the grain of my argument. Evolution is a life process in which creatures, in what they do, establish what others in turn must undergo, and history is but a local version of it. It is a version, however, that in the combined work of imagination and memory, that is, in the work of longing, has stretched the very fabric of time. What, then, would a general theory of evolution that could thus encompass human history as a specific instance? What would such a theory be? It would, of course, be a theory of correspondence. And then finally, what of anthropology itself? More than any other discipline in the human sciences, I believe anthropology has the means and the determination to show how knowledge grows from the crucible of lives lived with others in the in-between. And this knowledge consists not in propositions about the world, but in capacities of judgment that develop in the course of direct, practical, and sensuous engagements with the beings and things with whom and with which we share our lives. For like people everywhere and at all times, we are both observers and participants. There's no contradiction here. It's important to refute once and for all the commonplace fallacy that observation is a practice exclusively dedicated to the objectification of the beings and things that command our attention, and their removal from the sphere of our sentient involvement with consociates. And the source of the problem lies in that little word of. For whenever we invoke the anthropology of this or that, it's as though we run rings around the thing in question, turning the paths along which we observe into circumscribed topics of inquiry. It's this of that converts observation into objectification. But to observe with is not to objectify. It is to attend to persons and things, to learn from them, and to follow in precept and practice. So whereas ofness is intentional, withness is attentional. And herein, I contend, lies the purpose, dynamic, and potential of anthropology. It is to join with others in an ongoing exploration of what the possibilities and potentials of life might be. Our responsibilities, therefore, are to the future. What we seek are ways to answer to the world. And in this, anthropology, too, is, indeed, must be, a practice of correspondence. Thank you very much.